My sister called me a poor trash worker right to my face. My father laughed into his expensive wine, mocking my job and my life in the very restaurant I had built from absolutely nothing. But their smug smiles vanished when a stranger walked up to our table, looked around the luxurious dining room, and asked a simple question that made everyone freeze. He asked who owns this place. My name is Isabella. I am 33 years old, and tonight I watched my family's arrogance shatter into a million pieces. I wiped a streak of dark grease from my hands, using a pristine white cloth towel. The main dining room of Lumina, Chicago's most exclusive culinary destination, hummed with the quiet, expensive energy of the city's elite. Crystal glasses clinked, jazz played softly from hidden speakers, and the rich scent of white truffles filled the air. I had just spent the last 40 minutes in the back kitchen, standing shoulder to shoulder with my executive chef, manually repairing a malfunctioning commercial gas valve. As the founder and CEO of Lumina Hospitality, I refused to let a mechanical failure ruin my guests' evening. I was wearing a simple black chef's apron over my everyday clothes, smelling faintly of roasted garlic and engine grease. I did not care about looking glamorous. I cared about running an empire. I approached Table 4, our premium VIP booth located right by the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sitting there were the four people who shared my blood, but had never truly been my family. My sister Camilla, my father Richard, my mother Beatrice, and Camilla's husband Elijah. Camilla looked me up and down with absolute disgust. At 35, she was a woman obsessed with the illusion of high society, wearing heavily branded clothing to mask her deep insecurities. She picked up the black leather check presenter and tossed it aggressively across the table. It slid and hit my apron, tumbling to the floor. $4,500, Camilla said, her voice dripping with venom. Pay it. Consider it the price of getting to breathe the same air as high society. You work as a poor trash worker cleaning up grease in some back alley kitchen, so you should be used to serving your betters. Pay the bill, Isabella. It is the least you can do to earn your keep in this family. My father Richard did not even bother to look up at me. He simply laughed, swirling his $300 glass of Cabernet Sauvignon, letting the cruel joke hang in the air. He was a man who worshipped money and despised anyone he deemed beneath him, including his own youngest daughter. I did not cry. I did not flinch. I just looked down at the massive bill they had racked up. They had intentionally ordered imported caviar, multiple seafood towers, and 3 bottles of vintage champagne just to run up the tab. My mother Beatrice adjusted her diamond necklace and sighed dramatically. Do not be so stingy, Isabella. Ever since you ran away from home at 18 with absolutely nothing, you have been completely useless to this family. You never send money. You never help out. Look at your brother-in-law Elijah. He just bought me a brand new Chanel bag last week. That is what a real provider looks like. I stared right into my mother's eyes, my voice entirely flat and devoid of emotion. Of course Elijah can afford to buy you Chanel bags, mother. He bought that purse using the $60,000 you drained out of my dedicated college savings account. You stole my tuition money to fund Camilla's lavish wedding and pay for Elijah's down payment on his luxury car. You left me with nothing, forcing me to work 3 manual labor jobs just to survive while you threw parties. Elijah leaned forward, slapping his hand on the table. As an African-American investment broker who practically bathed in arrogance, he loved asserting his dominance over anyone he deemed a subordinate. He adjusted his custom silk tie and let out a condescending chuckle. Do not be bitter just because you are at the bottom of the food chain, Isabella, Elijah mocked, leaning back into the leather booth. I am the director of brokerage at Crestview Partners. In fact, I am about to close a massive land acquisition deal with the billionaire real estate tycoon Maxwell Thorne. Once that contract is signed next week, I will be stepping into the billionaire class myself. You are just social scum. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life scrubbing floors while we run the world. I held his gaze, completely unfazed by his pathetic posturing. I knew exactly who Maxwell Thorne was. What Elijah did not know was that Maxwell Thorne was not just a billionaire. He was my closest strategic partner, and he happened to be dining in my private room tonight. Right on cue, a tall, imposing man in a sharp charcoal suit approached our table. It was Maxwell Thorne himself, taking a brief break from his private dinner. Elijah spotted him instantly. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by the desperate, hungry look of a man trying to secure vital funding. Elijah practically knocked over his own chair, jumping up to his feet. He smoothed his jacket and thrust his hand out toward the billionaire, desperate to make a good impression. "Mr. Thorne," Elijah announced loudly, making sure the neighboring tables could hear his desperate networking attempt. "Elijah here, director at Crestview Partners. We have that upcoming acquisition meeting. It is an absolute honor to run into you tonight." Maxwell Thorne did not even glance at Elijah's outstretched hand. He completely ignored the man, leaving Elijah awkwardly frozen in place. Instead, the billionaire stepped around him and stopped directly in front of me. To the absolute shock of my family, Maxwell Thorne bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound professional respect. "Good evening, Isabella," Maxwell said, his rich voice echoing over the quiet jazz music. "The executive chef told me you were back there fixing the mainline oven yourself. Only you would get your hands dirty on a busy Saturday night. I have been meaning to ask you, when is the brilliant owner of this magnificent restaurant going to stop making me wait and finally sign that franchise lease agreement for my new skyscraper?" The entire table froze. The color drained from Camilla's face so fast she looked like a ghost. Richard choked on his expensive wine, coughing violently into his cloth napkin. Elijah's hand remained suspended in midair, trembling slightly as his eyes darted from the billionaire to my grease-stained apron. He dropped his silver dessert fork, the loud clatter cutting through the silence of the dining room. "Owner," Elijah whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his sudden humiliation. I picked up the black leather check presenter from the floor and tossed it onto the table, letting it slide right onto Elijah's empty plate. "That is right, Elijah," I said, a cold, triumphant smile forming on my lips. "I am the founder and CEO of Lumina Hospitality. This is my restaurant, and you have exactly 2 minutes to pay your own bill before I have you thrown out into the street." Terrence stared at me across the table, his eyes narrowed in disbelief. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, a nervous tick disguised as a confident gesture, preparing to call me a liar. He opened his mouth to tell me I was insane, to remind me I was nothing but a grease-stained failure in his eyes. But before a single insult could leave his throat, a commanding presence materialized right behind his chair. It was Jonathan Pierce. The billionaire real estate mogul stood at 6'2", wearing a meticulously tailored charcoal suit that radiated quiet generational wealth. He was the exact kind of titan Terrence spent his entire life trying to emulate and impress. Terrence spotted him instantly. The smug arrogance melted off my brother-in-law's face, replaced entirely by the frantic, desperate hunger of a corporate climber. Terrence practically tripped over his own expensive leather shoes as he leaped up from the booth. He shoved his hand out eagerly, blocking Jonathan's path. "Mr. Pierce," Terrence announced, his voice booming artificially loud so the neighboring tables could hear his desperate networking attempt. "Terrence here, Senior Wealth Manager at Crestview Investments. My firm has been begging your office for that upcoming acquisition meeting for months. It is an absolute honor to run into you tonight. I would love to buy your table a bottle of your finest vintage." Jonathan Pierce did not smile. He did not introduce himself. He looked at Terrence's outstretched, eager hand, the way someone looks at a piece of gum stuck to the bottom of their shoe. He did not offer a single word of acknowledgement. Instead, the billionaire stepped right around Terrence, leaving the wealth manager frozen with his hands suspended in midair, utterly humiliated in the center of the crowded dining room. Jonathan stopped directly in front of me. To the absolute shock of my family, the billionaire bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound, undeniable professional respect. "Madison, my apologies for interrupting your evening," Jonathan said, his rich voice carrying clearly across our table. "The executive chef told me you were back there fixing the mainline oven yourself. Only you would get your hands dirty on a busy Saturday night when you have a staff of 200 people. I have been meaning to ask you, when is the brilliant owner of this magnificent place going to stop making me wait? When are you finally going to sign that franchise lease agreement for my new skyscraper?" The entire table stopped breathing. The lively jazz music playing overhead seemed to fade into a vacuum of stunned, suffocating silence. Vanessa's jaw literally dropped. The cruel sneer she had worn just moments ago completely vanished, replaced by a pale, sickly expression of shock. She looked from my stained black apron to the billionaire standing before me, her brain short-circuiting as she tried to comprehend that the sister she had just called a poor trash worker was actually negotiating multi-million-dollar real estate deals. Terrence looked like he had been punched violently in the stomach. He slowly lowered his unshaken hand to his side, his expensive facade cracking into a million irrecoverable pieces. The man who had just bragged about his social superiority was now staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. William. My father sat frozen with his wine glass halfway to his mouth. The dark red liquid trembled, splashing slightly onto his cuffs because his hands were shaking. Owner, Terrence choked out his voice, a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. You are signing a commercial lease with Jonathan Pierce. I did not break eye contact with my brother-in-law. I wiped my hands on my apron and offered a cold, razor-sharp smile. Yes, Terrence, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet tension like a knife. A 50,000 square foot commercial lease in the financial district. It requires actual verified capital, not the fraudulent tax exemptions you claim on those leased luxury cars just to pretend you are rich. I build real empires. You just rent yours to impress strangers. Terrence swallowed hard, shrinking back into the leather booth as the reality of his own pathetic posturing crushed him. But my mother, Patricia, was a different breed of parasite. Recognizing the sheer magnitude of power and wealth standing at our table, she recovered with terrifying speed. Patricia practically shoved William out of the way as she stood up. Her face stretched into a sickeningly sweet theatrical smile. She reached across the table, attempting to physically grab my arm to show Jonathan Pierce how close we were. Our daughter owns this, Patricia gasped, pressing her hands to her chest in an Oscar-worthy performance of maternal pride. Oh, Jonathan, we are just so incredibly proud of her. We taught her everything she knows about hard work and resilience. Why did you not tell us, darling, we are family? We would have loved to celebrate this with you. I looked down at her manicured hand, reaching for my arm. I did not just pull away. I slapped her hand back down onto the table with a loud, sharp smack. Do not touch me, I ordered, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. And do not dare act like you had any part in my success. You taught me resilience by forcing me to sleep in my car at 18 while you drained my bank accounts. You threw me out with absolutely nothing. Patricia gasped, looking frantically at Jonathan to see if he was judging her. He was. The billionaire crossed his arms, staring at my mother with open disgust. I turned my back on my mother's fake tears. I raised my hand in the air and snapped my fingers sharply. The sound echoed through the dining room. Immediately, the waitstaff stopped what they were doing. I gave the signal we had established for hostile removals. It was time to take out the trash. The heavy glass doors of Lumina shut firmly behind them, cutting off my mother's shrill, indignant protests. I stood in the center of my dining room, adjusting the cuffs of my sleeves as I watched through the window. My security team stood like stone statues, ensuring my parents, my sister Camilla, and my arrogant brother-in-law Elijah stepped entirely off my property line. The satisfaction of finally taking out the trash was undeniably sweet, but I knew my family too well. They were parasites. And parasites do not simply walk away when their host cuts off the blood supply. They regroup. They mutate. They find a new, more vicious way to draw blood. By 6 o'clock the next morning, I was already at my desk. My private office, suspended just above the main dining room, was a quiet sanctuary of frosted glass, brushed steel, and relentless efficiency. I was reviewing the preliminary architectural blueprints for the new franchise location when my director of public relations, a razor-sharp woman named Carmen, rushed into my office without bothering to knock. Her face was completely drained of color. She slid her tablet across my polished mahogany desk, her hands trembling slightly. She told me I needed to look at the screen immediately. I pressed play. It was a video posted to every major social media platform just an hour before sunrise. The screen showed my sister Camilla. She had clearly scrubbed off her heavy designer makeup, leaving her face pale and deliberately vulnerable. She wore a simple, inexpensive gray sweater, a stark and calculated contrast to the thousands of dollars in luxury brands she had flaunted at my VIP table just the night before. She was crying, producing large, theatrical tears that would have won her a daytime television award if she were not such a spectacularly terrible actress in reality. In the video, Camilla stared directly into the camera lens with a quivering lip. She claimed to the world that her highly successful billionaire-backed sister had brutally and violently assaulted their frail elderly parents during a simple, loving family dinner. She sobbed, her voice breaking perfectly on cue, as she described me ordering armed thugs to physically drag our helpless mother out into the freezing Chicago street. But the real poison came next. Camilla leaned closer to the camera and whispered her fabricated dark secret. She told her millions of new viewers that the only reason my restaurant empire existed was because I had maliciously stolen our parents' entire life savings and retirement funds. She claimed I had left them absolutely destitute, struggling to pay for basic medication while I lived a life of unimaginable luxury. I watched the view count flashing in the corner of the screen. It was skyrocketing by the second: 2 million views, 5 million views. It was spreading like a highly contagious virus. Carmen started listing the collateral damage, her voice laced with rising panic. Cancel culture moves faster than a wildfire, and the flames were already licking at our doors. The hashtag Boycott Lumina was currently trending at #1 nationwide. Our front desk reservation lines had been ringing incessantly since dawn, entirely with high-profile guests demanding to cancel their upcoming bookings. Our corporate inbox was flooded with death threats and hate mail. Online review platforms were being bombarded with tens of thousands of fake one-star reviews, calling me an elder abuser, a corporate monster, and a disgrace to the culinary world. Carmen leaned over my desk, pleading with me to let her team record a soft, sympathetic response video immediately. She wanted me to wear neutral colors, to sit on a comfortable couch, and to issue a gentle, emotional apology. She begged me to say that emotions ran high, to offer a public reconciliation, and to promise to take care of my parents. She insisted that fighting back aggressively against a crying woman would only make me look like the exact heartless villain Camilla had painted me to be. I reached out, turned off the tablet screen, and shoved it back toward her. I did not flinch. I did not panic. I simply picked up my espresso cup and took a slow, deliberate sip. "I will not apologize," I said, my voice steady, cold, and echoing with absolute authority. "If I issue a soft apology, I validate her lies. Camilla and my parents have been playing this exact psychological game since I was 10 years old. Whenever they failed, whenever their own staggering financial incompetence caught up to them, they painted me as the unstable, crazy daughter to cover their tracks. They used me as their scapegoat to maintain their perfect high society image while they drowned in debt. We do not negotiate with emotional terrorists, Carmen, and we certainly do not apologize to parasites." Carmen looked terrified, asking how we were supposed to stop a public relations nightmare of this magnitude before investors started pulling out. "We do not fight fake tears with real tears," I replied, standing up and straightening my blazer. "We fight manipulation with indisputable legal facts. I want you to organize a live press conference right here in the main dining room for tomorrow morning. Invite every major culinary critic, financial reporter, and local news outlet in the city. Tell them Isabella will address the theft allegations directly. I am going to show the world exactly who the real thieves are." Just as I started outlining my strategy to publicly expose their financial history, my office door swung open again. This time it was my executive chef. He was breathing heavily, his pristine white coat stained with morning prep. He looked absolutely frantic. He told me the morning delivery trucks had just pulled up to the loading dock and then immediately drove away without unloading a single crate. Our exclusive imported seafood, the premium cuts of Wagyu beef, the organic local produce from artisanal farms, everything had been halted. The drivers told the kitchen staff that their corporate dispatchers gave strict orders to freeze all deliveries to Lumina Hospitality immediately. I frowned, pulling my laptop closer to check our corporate vendor accounts. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I logged into our primary banking portal. A bright red warning banner flashed across the screen. My commercial lines of credit, the specific financial accounts used to automatically pay our vast network of suppliers, had been completely frozen. There was a bold notice stating an emergency suspension was active, pending a federal fraud investigation. The pieces clicked together in my mind with terrifying clarity. This was not just a social media attack. Camilla's viral video was merely a distraction, a loud emotional smokescreen meant to damage my public image, while the real threat attacked my infrastructure in the shadows. Elijah, my arrogant, vindictive brother-in-law, was a senior director of brokerage at Crestview Partners. He managed massive wealth portfolios and had deep, insidious connections within the corporate banking sector. Furious over his public humiliation with the billionaire Maxwell Thorne, the night before Elijah was weaponizing his position in the financial district. I had leveraged his banking contacts to flag my accounts under the guise of the very fraud allegations Camilla had just broadcasted to the world. He knew exactly how the restaurant industry worked. A high-end establishment like Lumina relied on daily fresh deliveries to survive. Without credit to pay the suppliers, the kitchen would shut down today. Without ingredients, there was no food. Without food, the empire crumbles. Elijah was trying to financially choke me out before I even had the chance to defend myself in the press. The private line on my desk began to ring. The caller identification display showed a blocked number, but I knew exactly who was on the other end. I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear without saying a word. Elijah's voice oozed through the speaker, dripping with smug, arrogant satisfaction. "Good morning, Isabella." Elijah chuckled, a dark, victorious sound. "I hear you are having some trouble getting your little ingredients delivered today. It is a real shame how quickly a business can starve when its supply lines mysteriously dry up. Give up the restaurant. Sign the controlling ownership shares over to my firm to manage your debt, and I will make sure your little credit problem disappears. Otherwise, you will be out of business by dinner service." The sharp crack of my fingers echoing through the private dining room was a sound my staff knew intimately. It was the absolute non-negotiable signal for a hostile removal. Within seconds, 4 massive security guards in tailored black suits stepped out from the shadows of the corridor, moving silently toward our table. But my father, Richard, was a man whose delusion knew no bounds. Even with his public humiliation hanging heavy in the air, and billionaire Maxwell Thorne watching his every move with open disgust, Richard tried to spin the narrative. He forced a booming, entirely artificial laugh, straightening his posture as if he were addressing a country club mixer rather than a daughter he had discarded. "Now, Isabella, there is no need to be dramatic," Richard said, his voice dripping with that familiar patronizing warmth he used to manipulate business partners. "Everything your mother and I did was to build your character. If we had not cut you off at 18, if we had not given you that push into the real world, you never would have developed the grit required to build a hospitality empire like Lumina. We gave you the greatest gift a parent can give. We gave you drive." Beatrice eagerly latched onto his delusion. She clasped her hands together, her diamond rings catching the ambient light. "Exactly. We always knew you had this fire inside you. The $60,000 we repurposed was simply a lesson in financial independence. And look at you now. You are rubbing elbows with Maxwell Thorne. You should be thanking us for making you into this powerhouse." I looked at the two people who shared my DNA, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold clinical detachment. "A lesson in financial independence." I repeated, my tone razor sharp. "Is that what you call forging my signature on 3 different credit card applications when I was a college freshman, just so you could finance a luxury speedboat? You tanked my credit score to a miserable 400 before I was even old enough to buy a drink. I spent my 20s fighting off aggressive debt collectors for loans I never took out. You did not build my character, Richard. You built a financial prison, and I had to claw my way out of it with my bare hands. Do not dare claim credit for the empire I built on the ashes of your greed." Maxwell Thorne let out a low, disapproving scoff, shaking his head as he looked at my parents. The billionaire's blatant disgust was the ultimate social death sentence, and Elijah felt it slipping away. The African-American investment broker was sweating profusely now. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. The multi-million-dollar acquisition deal he desperately needed to save his sinking career at Crestview Partners was evaporating right before his eyes. Elijah stepped forward, positioning himself between me and Maxwell Thorne. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to command the space, but his voice carried a frantic, pathetic edge. Listen to me, Isabella, Elijah demanded, trying to manufacture authority. We can put all this ancient history behind us. You are a CEO now. You understand how corporate synergy works. You need to use your influence with Mr. Thorne right now. Tell him to sign the land acquisition contracts with Crestview Partners. We are family. You owe me this. If you secure this deal for my firm, I am willing to forgive your disrespect tonight. I stared at him, genuinely marveling at his staggering audacity. He was begging for a bailout while simultaneously trying to act like he was doing me a favor. I let out a slow, chilling laugh. "Oh, you. That is a very interesting choice of words, Elijah. Tell me, does Crestview Partners know how much you owe the Internal Revenue Service? Because from what my industry contacts tell me, you have been claiming fraudulent business exemptions on those 3 leased luxury cars you use to pretend you are a heavy hitter. You are drowning in debt, living paycheck to paycheck on a 6-figure salary just to keep up appearances. I build real wealth. You just lease a convincing costume." Elijah's jaw clenched, his eyes darting frantically to Maxwell Thorne to see if the billionaire was listening. Thorne was watching with intense analytical interest. "You are lying," Elijah hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You do not know anything about my finances. You are just a bitter, vindictive woman trying to ruin my reputation." I calmly reached into my apron pocket and pulled out my smartphone. "I do not need to lie, Elijah. You do a brilliant job of ruining your own reputation. In fact, let us recall exactly what you think of me when you do not need my billionaire connections." I unlocked my screen, opened my audio files, and pressed play, turning the volume all the way up. The recording was crystal clear. It was a voicemail Elijah had accidentally left on my secondary business line just 3 days ago when he was trying to track down my sister. Elijah's arrogant, sneering voice echoed through the high-end dining room for everyone to hear. "Tell that low-class, bottom-feeding subordinate sister of yours to call me back. I swear dealing with a pathetic kitchen rat like Isabella is exhausting. She will be serving our table on Saturday, so make sure she knows her place." I paused the audio. The silence that followed was suffocating. Maxwell Thorne raised an eyebrow, looking at Elijah with absolute, unfiltered contempt. "A bottom-feeding subordinate," I said softly, pocketing my phone. "Well, Elijah, this subordinate is the only reason you are standing in a VIP dining room right now, and I am officially revoking your access." Camilla snapped. The reality that her perfect elite facade was being dismantled by the sister she had mocked her entire life was too much for her fragile ego to handle. Her face turned a blotchy, furious red. She grabbed her heavy crystal water glass from the table and hurled the contents directly at my face, screaming that I was a monster who was tearing their family apart. I simply stepped half a pace to the left. The water sailed past my shoulders, splashing harmlessly onto the polished hardwood floor. The crystal glass slipped from Camilla's trembling hand and shattered loudly against the base of the booth. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the 4 massive security guards who had silently formed a perimeter around the table. "Take the trash out," I ordered calmly, "and march them right through the center of the main dining room. I want every single guest to see exactly what happens when people disrespect my staff and my establishment." The security guards moved with military precision. They flanked my family, physically directing them away from the VIP booth. Beatrice shrieked, clutching her expensive handbag as a guard pointed her toward the exit. Richard tried to puff out his chest, threatening to sue the restaurant, but a firm hand on his shoulder kept him moving forward. Camilla was sobbing, angry, humiliated tears, trying to hide her face behind her hair. But the absolute best part was watching Elijah. The arrogant, high-powered broker was forced to walk the walk of shame through a dining room packed with Chicago's wealthiest elites. Tourists and business executives alike pulled out their smartphones, recording the pathetic spectacle. The camera flashes illuminated their disgrace. I stood next to Maxwell Thorne, watching them get shoved through the heavy glass front doors and out into the biting Chicago night air. "Well," Maxwell said, taking a sip from his glass, "that was certainly more entertaining than reviewing lease contracts. Shall we head up to your office and finalize that paperwork, Isabella?" "We absolutely shall," I replied, turning my back on the street. The first battle was won, but I knew the war was just beginning. They would not take this public execution quietly. They would retaliate, and I was completely ready to destroy them when they did. I needed immediate operational capital. With Elijah illegally freezing my commercial supply accounts through his corrupt network at Crestview Partners, my restaurants had exactly 12 hours before the evening service collapsed. I did not waste time panicking over my sister's viral video or my brother-in-law's financial chokehold. I grabbed my coat and drove straight to my primary financial institution in the heart of Chicago's financial district. I needed my branch manager to authorize an emergency unsecured line of credit to bypass Elijah's digital blockade and pay my farmers and meat distributors directly in cash. I bypassed the main teller line and walked purposefully toward the executive glass offices. My dedicated wealth manager, David, usually kept his door open for me. Today, the heavy frosted glass door was shut, and the blinds were partially drawn. I did not bother knocking. I pushed the door open, ready to demand immediate action. I stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting in the plush leather guest chairs opposite David were two people who had absolutely no business being anywhere near my corporate bank accounts: my father Richard and my mother Beatrice. Richard was leaning over David's mahogany desk, gripping a gold-plated pen. Beatrice was smiling that sickeningly sweet, persuasive smile she always used when she was trying to extract money from someone else's wallet. Spread across the desk were thick stacks of financial documents, commercial property deeds, and equity transfer requests. David looked up, his face pale and shining with nervous sweat. He let out a massive sigh of relief when he saw me standing in the doorway. "Isabella, thank goodness you are here," David said, quickly gathering the papers. "Your parents told me you were stuck in gridlock traffic, but had given them full authorization to initiate a $3 million equity loan using the flagship Lumina property as collateral. They handed me a signed power of attorney, but corporate policy requires verbal confirmation for anything over $1 million. I stepped fully into the office and let the heavy glass door click shut behind me. I turned the deadbolt lock. The loud metallic click echoed in the small room, sealing us inside. I walked over to the desk, picked up the supposed power of attorney document, and looked at the signature line. It was a remarkably good forgery. The loops and angles were a close match to my actual signature, clearly traced from some old family document they had kept. But it was a forgery. "Still forging my name, Richard?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft as I tossed the fraudulent document back onto the desk. "I suppose old habits die hard. Just like when I was a 19-year-old college student and you forged my signature on 3 different high-limit credit cards. You completely destroyed my credit score so you could buy a luxury pontoon boat to impress your country club friends. Only this time you are not stealing a few $1,000s to buy a toy. You are attempting to illegally leverage my $10 million restaurant empire." David, the bank manager, physically recoiled from the desk as if the documents had suddenly caught fire. He stammered, looking at my father in absolute horror, asking if the signature was falsified. Richard slammed his pen down, his face flushing dark red. He immediately tried to spin the narrative, falling back on his favorite tactic of treating me like an incompetent child. "Do not listen to her, David," Richard commanded, puffing out his chest to manufacture authority. "Isabella is just being a dramatic, overworked CEO who forgets our verbal agreements. We had a family meeting about this. She is just confused from the stress of her public relations crisis this morning." Beatrice stood up, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. She reached out and tried to touch my shoulder, playing the role of the deeply concerned mother. "Isabella, darling, your father is right," Beatrice cooed, though her eyes were completely dead. "You have been under a lot of stress lately. Stop making a scene in front of David. Just co-sign the loan right now. Elijah is facing a terrible liquidity crisis at his firm, and we need this cash to bail him out before the regulators notice his accounts are short. We are a family. We protect our own." I stepped back, entirely avoiding her toxic reach. I looked directly at the bank manager. "David, freeze all processing on those documents immediately." I instructed, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "I have never authorized any commercial loan. I have never granted my parents power of attorney over my personal or business assets. The paperwork sitting on your desk constitutes felony bank fraud and identity theft." Richard lost his temper. The polished upper-class facade evaporated, revealing the desperate, greedy parasite hiding underneath. He pointed a trembling finger right in my face, his voice rising to a furious shout. "You owe us this money!" Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "We brought you into this world. We are your parents. You are legally and morally obligated to save this family from financial ruin. Elijah is about to lose everything, and if he goes down, he is taking our entire retirement portfolio with him. You will sign those papers, Isabella, or I swear I will ruin you. Will ruin." I did not argue with his delusion. I did not scream back. I simply reached into my tailored jacket pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and dialed 911. I tapped the speaker icon and set the phone down right on top of his forged documents. The emergency dispatcher answered immediately, asking for the location of my emergency. "My name is Isabella," I stated clearly into the microphone, keeping my eyes locked on my father's terrified face. "I am at the First Commercial Bank in the financial district. I need police officers dispatched immediately. I am currently locked in a manager's office with two individuals attempting a multi-million-dollar commercial bank fraud and identity theft." Richard lunged forward, his face twisted in absolute unhinged rage. He slammed his fists onto the desk, screaming that I was a monster that I would burn in hell for turning against my own blood. I looked him dead in the eye and smiled. "I will see you in handcuffs first, Richard." The main dining room of Aura had been transformed overnight. The tables where my family had sat just 48 hours ago were cleared away, replaced by rows of folding chairs packed with Chicago's top culinary critics, financial reporters, and local news anchors. Camera crews had set up their tripods near the floor-to-ceiling windows, their lenses focused entirely on a single wooden podium. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. My public relations director, Carmen, had warned me that the media was out for blood. The cancel culture mob wanted a show. They wanted to see the wealthy, arrogant restaurant owner break down in tears and beg her poor elderly parents for forgiveness. They expected a soft, emotional surrender. I gave them a highly orchestrated execution instead. I did not wear neutral, sympathetic colors. I wore a sharply tailored crimson suit. I walked to the podium with the absolute confidence of a woman who owned the ground she stood on. The flashbulbs erupted blindingly bright, but I did not blink. I stepped up to the microphone, placed a single manila folder on the wooden stand, and looked out over the sea of hungry journalists. "Good morning," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the sound system. "Yesterday, my sister Vanessa released a video to the public. In that video, she claimed that I built this restaurant empire by stealing our parents' life savings and leaving them destitute. She claimed I was an abusive, unstable daughter who violently threw her family into the street. I know that a story about a greedy, heartless CEO makes for excellent clickbait, but I do not deal in stories, I deal in facts." I raised my hand and snapped my fingers. The overhead lights in the dining room immediately dimmed. Behind me, a massive projector screen dropped down from the ceiling. "I am not here to issue an apology," I stated, staring directly into the main broadcasting camera. "I am here to show you exactly what it looks like when a family of parasites runs out of blood to suck." I pressed a button on the remote in my hand. The massive screen lit up. A collective gasp rippled through the front row of reporters. "This is a certified bank statement from exactly 15 years ago," I explained, pointing to the glowing numbers. "It is the dedicated college trust fund my grandfather left entirely in my name. And right next to it is the withdrawal slip draining all $60,000 from that account. Notice the signature at the bottom. It belongs to my father, William. He did not withdraw that money to pay for my education or his retirement. He withdrew it to pay for Vanessa's destination wedding in Italy and to fund a down payment on a luxury vehicle for my brother-in-law, Terrence." Cameras clicked frantically. Reporters were already typing on their laptops. I clicked to the next slide. It showed 3 credit card applications heavily highlighted. "These are high-limit credit cards opened in my name when I was 18 years old." I continued, my voice cold and unwavering. "My parents forged my signature to fund their country club lifestyle, effectively destroying my credit score before I was even old enough to buy a drink. When I confronted them, they kicked me out of the house with nothing. I slept in my car. I worked 3 manual labor jobs to pay off the debt they fraudulently accumulated in my name. I did not give the room a chance to process the shock before hitting them with the final blow regarding Aura." I switched to the third slide. Vanessa claimed I built this restaurant using my parents' retirement money. I said, displaying a series of corporate tax records, commercial loan agreements, and incorporation documents. These are the founding financial records for Lumina Hospitality. You will see my name and my name alone. You will see commercial business loans secured entirely by my own hard work, completely independent of my family. I have not received a single dime from William or Patricia since I was a child. In fact, I have zero financial ties to them whatsoever. Numbers do not cry and numbers do not lie. The silence in the dining room was absolute. The reporters were completely captivated. The victim narrative Vanessa had so carefully crafted online was being systematically obliterated by undeniable legal paperwork. I had just provided every news outlet in the city with hard evidence of financial abuse and fraud committed by my own parents. But I was not finished. I turned my attention away from the screen and looked dead center into the local news camera, broadcasting live across the city. It was time to deal with the man who had tried to choke out my supply chain. While my sister was busy posting fake tears on the internet, her husband was busy manipulating the federal banking system, I announced, letting the weight of the accusations settle over the room. Terrence is a senior wealth manager at Crestview Investments. Yesterday morning, in a petty act of retaliation for being thrown out of my restaurant, Terrence abused his corporate banking connections to illegally freeze my commercial supply accounts. I tried to shut down my business by starving my kitchens. I leaned closer to the microphone. But Terrence made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed I would panic. Instead, I hired a private forensic accountant. And what that accountant found hidden deep inside Terrence's exact loan portfolios at his firm was far more interesting than a petty family feud. The reporters leaned forward, hanging on my every word. Terrence is not just threatening suppliers, I revealed, letting a razor-sharp smile cross my face. He is running a massive coordinated Ponzi scheme using his clients' funds. He has been systematically draining elderly investors' retirement accounts to maintain his own fraudulent lifestyle. And the most poetic part of it all, his biggest investors, the people whose money he has been funneling into his own pockets, are his own parents-in-law, William and Patricia. The dining room erupted into chaos. Journalists began shouting questions, realizing this had just evolved from a local restaurant drama into a massive federal financial crime story. I ignored the screaming reporters. I did not take a single question. I simply stared directly into the camera lens, my expression turning to ice. And to my brother-in-law Terrence, I hope you are watching, because the SEC is watching you. High above the Chicago financial district, inside the lavish corner office of Crestview Partners, Elijah was suffocating on his own panic. The pristine, arrogant facade he had maintained for years was completely melting away, replaced by the frantic, terrified movements of a cornered animal. He was practically tearing his custom mahogany desk apart. His hands shook violently as he grabbed a stack of offshore account ledgers, a secondary passport, and bundles of emergency cash, shoving them recklessly into a black leather briefcase. On his oversized computer monitor, the live stream of my press conference was still playing. My voice echoed through his office speakers, clear and resolute, as I publicly announced to the entire city that he was running a massive Ponzi scheme. Elijah slammed his hand against the monitor, knocking it face down onto the desk, but he could not shut the sound off. He knew it was over. He knew the multi-million-dollar illusion he used to belittle me had just violently collapsed. He grabbed his briefcase and bolted toward the heavy glass doors of his suite. He intended to slip out through the private executive elevator and disappear before the fallout reached him. He did not even make it halfway across the room. The heavy glass doors of his office did not just open, they were violently kicked apart. A swarm of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with prominent yellow letters, identifying them as federal regulators and marshals, flooded into the executive suite. They moved with terrifying coordinated speed. Elijah stumbled backward, dropping his leather briefcase. The latches popped open upon impact, spilling incriminating financial ledgers and stacks of cash across the imported rug. He raised his hands in the air, his eyes wide with sheer terror. But his deeply ingrained arrogance made one final pathetic attempt to save him. You cannot just barge in here, Elijah shouted, his voice cracking loudly. Do you have any idea who I am? I am the director of brokerage at this firm. I manage accounts for billionaires. I demand to call my corporate attorneys right this second. The lead federal agent did not slow down. He did not care about Elijah's title, his custom suit, or his empty threats. The agent grabbed Elijah by the shoulder, spun him around, and shoved him hard against the wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The cold, heavy metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around Elijah's wrists echoed sharply over the chaotic noise of the raid. You have the right to remain silent, the agent stated, his voice a flat, uncompromising growl. And I highly suggest you use it because your financial records are currently speaking volumes. Elijah was dragged out of his corner office, kicking and struggling right into the center of the main trading floor. The entire firm had ground to a halt. Dozens of junior brokers, analysts, and administrative assistants stood frozen at their desks, watching the man who had ruthlessly bullied and demeaned them for years being paraded through the room like a common criminal. Several employees pulled out their smartphones, recording his humiliating downfall. Elijah tried to hide his face, ducking his head away from the cameras, but the bright overhead lights illuminated every second of his public disgrace. Across the city, standing in the quiet sanctuary of my private office at Aura, I watched the breaking news alert flash across my television screen. News helicopters were already circling the Crestview Partners building, broadcasting live footage of federal agents hauling boxes of seized hard drives and physical documents out the front doors. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my espresso. I had not just dropped a bombshell on a live broadcast for dramatic effect. That is not how I operate. I do not rely on public shaming to do the heavy lifting. 5 hours before I stepped up to that podium to face the press, I had my corporate attorney send the complete unredacted file compiled by my forensic accountant directly to the regional director of the Federal Regulatory Agency. I did not just give them a tip. I handed them a perfectly wrapped, indisputable criminal case. The file contained exact routing numbers, offshore wire transfer logs, and the specific names of the elderly investors Elijah had systematically defrauded, including my own parents. When you hand the federal government a massive ongoing wire fraud operation with undeniable proof, they move with absolute devastating speed. I knew the raid was going to happen. I simply timed my press conference to ensure Elijah's reputation was destroyed at the exact same moment his freedom was taken away. The sudden aggressive vibrating of my smartphone broke the silence in my office. I glanced down at the screen. The caller identification displayed my sister's name, Camilla. I set my espresso cup down, picked up the phone, and accepted the call. I did not even have the chance to say hello. "You absolute monster!" Camilla screamed into the receiver. Her voice was shrill, unhinged, and completely stripped of her usual high society polish. She was gasping for air between her frantic, hysterical sobs. "They took him. They dragged Elijah out of the building in handcuffs. Our bank accounts are frozen. The credit cards are declining. You ruined my life. You destroyed my family because you are just a jealous, bitter loser who cannot stand to see anyone else happy." "I did not force your husband to steal millions of dollars, Camilla," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any sympathy. "I just turned on the lights so the world could see the cockroaches scattering in the kitchen." "You think you have won?" Camilla shrieked, her tone turning incredibly dark and frantic. "You think you can just sit in your fancy restaurant and watch us burn? I am going to destroy you, Isabella. I swear on my life I am coming down there tonight. I will smash every window. I will rip your kitchens apart. I will burn your precious restaurant to the ground until you have absolutely nothing left, just like me." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with a desperate woman spiraling into madness. Instead, I calmly tapped the screen of my smartphone, activating the digital recording feature. A small red dot appeared, capturing every single word of her unhinged tirade. "Are you making a premeditated terroristic threat against my commercial property, Camilla?" I asked softly, setting the perfect trap. The violent crash of shattering glass echoed through the empty corridors of Lumina Hospitality. It was exactly 2 in the morning. A brutal Chicago thunderstorm was raging outside, masking the sound of the heavy reinforced back door caving in. I did not move. I simply took a slow, methodical sip of my freshly brewed espresso, sitting in the absolute pitch black of my private office. Downstairs in the main kitchen, erratic footsteps crunched over the broken safety glass. Through the high-resolution security monitors glowing faintly on my desk, I watched my sister Camilla stumble into the building. She was completely drenched from the rain, her expensive designer trench coat soaked and clinging to her shivering frame. She was breathing heavily, reeking of desperation and cheap courage. I had known she was coming. When you corner a parasite, it does not retreat gracefully. It lashes out, trying to inflict as much damage as possible before it starves. Camilla had spent her entire life believing she was untouchable, wrapped in the protective bubble of our parents' toxic favoritism. Now, with her husband Elijah, sitting in a federal holding cell, facing a decade in prison for massive financial fraud, that bubble had violently burst. She needed a multi-million-dollar bail, and she needed it by tomorrow morning. Through the monitors, I tracked her frantic progress. She bypassed the cash registers entirely. She was not here for petty theft. She was making a direct line for the executive stairwell leading to my private suite. She wanted the intellectual property. She wanted the proprietary master recipe ledgers, the exclusive supplier contracts, and the confidential investor lists. She intended to steal the very foundation of my empire and sell it to my biggest corporate competitors to buy her husband's freedom. The heavy oak door to my office slowly creaked open. Camilla slipped inside using the harsh, unsteady beam of her smartphone flashlight to cut through the darkness. She moved frantically toward the built-in filing cabinets lining the far wall. She grabbed a heavy brass paperweight from a side table and began smashing it against the lock of the primary drawer. She was sobbing, a pathetic, high-pitched sound of pure panic, striking the metal over and over again until the locking mechanism finally gave way. Camilla yanked the drawer open. She let out a breathless gasp of victory as her hands found exactly what she was looking for. She pulled out 3 thick leather-bound volumes stamped with the Lumina corporate crest. The master recipe and operations ledgers. "I have got you now," Camilla whispered to herself, clutching the books to her chest like a life raft. "You are done, Isabella." I set my ceramic espresso cup down on its saucer. The clink was quiet, but in the dead silence of the office, it sounded like a gunshot. Camilla froze, the smartphone slipping from her trembling fingers and clattering to the floor. I reached out and pressed the master switch on my desk. The overhead fluorescent lights snapped on with a blinding clinical brightness, flooding the entire executive suite in stark white light. Camilla shrieked, throwing her arm up to shield her eyes. When her vision finally adjusted, she stared at me in sheer, unadulterated horror. I was sitting perfectly relaxed in my high-backed leather chair, my hands steepled beneath my chin. "You have always been so remarkably predictable, Camilla," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the bright room. "Did you honestly believe the CEO of a multi-million-dollar hospitality group would leave her most valuable intellectual property sitting in a standard filing cabinet, secured by a $20 lock? You are holding 3 blank reservation logs from 5 years ago. But the felony breaking and entering charge you just committed to get them is very, very real." Camilla backed away, her chest heaving as the reality of the trap closed around her. The arrogant high society socialite was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, soaking wet criminal holding stolen property. "You set me up!" Camilla screamed, her voice cracking as she threw the heavy leather books onto the floor. "You knew I was coming. You are a psychopath, Isabella. I am leaving, and if you try to stop me, I swear I will tear this place apart." She turned to run toward the open office door. She made it exactly 2 steps before 2 massive figures stepped out from the shadows of the adjoining boardroom corridor, entirely blocking her only exit. They were not my private security guards. They were 2 fully uniformed officers from the Chicago Police Department, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts. I had provided them with Camilla's recorded threat to destroy my property hours ago, and they had been waiting silently in the dark with me ever since the glass shattered downstairs. "Camilla," I stated, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs, "I would like you to meet the authorities. Officers, this is the woman who threatened to burn my establishment to the ground. You have the security footage of her breaking through my loading dock doors." One of the officers stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back, ma'am. You are under arrest for commercial burglary, breaking and entering, and making terroristic threats." Camilla completely lost her mind. As the officer grabbed her wrist and forced her arm behind her back, she began thrashing wildly, screaming at the top of her lungs. The sharp, unmistakable click of the metal cuffs locking around her wrists sent her into absolute hysterics. "You cannot do this to me!" Camilla wailed, tears of genuine terror streaming down her face as the officers dragged her toward the door. "I am your sister. You are supposed to protect me. Elijah is in jail. My bank accounts are frozen. I have absolutely nothing left." "You have exactly what you earned," I replied, my expression completely devoid of mercy. "You spent 30 years treating me like garbage, relying on my parents' stolen money to fund your glamorous life. Your entire existence was a fraud. Tonight is simply the bill coming due." The officers pulled her out into the hallway, but Camilla dug her heels into the carpet, fighting against their grip. She turned her head back toward my office, her eyes wide, bloodshot, and filled with an intense, venomous hatred. She realized she was going to jail, but she wanted to inflict one final bleeding wound before she was taken away. "You think you have won because Elijah and I are ruined," Camilla shrieked, her voice echoing violently down the executive stairwell. "You think your little empire is safe. You have no idea what Mom and Dad are doing right now, Isabella." I did not react, but I kept my eyes locked on hers. "They lost all their money in Elijah's firm." Camilla laughed, a dark, manic, unhinged sound. "They are desperate. And they just signed a commercial lease right across the city. They took a massive multi-million-dollar cash loan from the underground syndicates. They are dealing with loan sharks, Isabella, ruthless, violent men. And Mom and Dad are using that dirty money to open a counterfeit restaurant using your exact brand style. They are going to crush you, and when they default on that loan, those violent men are going to come looking for the rich CEO daughter to collect." The police officers yanked her forward, cutting off her hysterical laughter. I listened to her footsteps fading down the stairs until the heavy back doors slammed shut, plunging the building back into the quiet rhythm of the storm outside. I sat alone in my bright office, digesting the venomous secret she had just spat at me. My parents were not just financially ruined. They had willingly climbed into bed with the criminal underworld just to build a counterfeit restaurant to destroy me. I picked up my espresso cup. It was still warm. I took a slow, calculated sip. If my parents wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate sabotage using dirty money, they were about to learn a very brutal lesson. I was not going to stop them. I was going to let them build their counterfeit restaurant, and then I was going to bury them inside it. 4 hours before, Camilla shattered my back glass door. I was sitting in my private office with my lead corporate attorney, Vincent. He was reviewing the preliminary injunction paperwork, preparing to shut down any intellectual property theft the moment my family tried to monetize my brand. The rain was already lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my suite. I told Vincent to put the legal documents away. I stood up, walked over to my heavy mahogany desk, and reached into the bottom drawer. It was the only drawer with a broken lock I had intentionally left unreplaced for the past week. I pulled out 3 thick, heavy leather-bound volumes and dropped them onto the center of the desk. The gold foil stamped on the covers read, "Lumina Hospitality Master Operations and Recipes." Vincent looked at the expensive books, then up at me. He was clearly confused as to why I was leaving my most guarded trade secrets out in the open on a night I knew a break-in was imminent. "I am not leaving my life's work out for a desperate thief, Vincent," I told him, tracing the gold lettering with my index finger. "I am leaving bait. Camilla is going to break into this office tonight. She is going to pry open that faulty drawer because it is the path of least resistance. She is going to steal these exact ledgers to give to my parents. They genuinely believe they can use my own culinary genius to build their counterfeit restaurant and crush me." Vincent leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concern. He asked if those were fake recipes. I smiled, pouring myself a fresh espresso from the machine behind my desk. "They are entirely authentic in their construction. They are practically identical to the actual recipes that earned Lumina its Michelin star, save for one microscopic, catastrophic alteration." I opened the first ledger to the signature dish that originally put my hospitality group on the map, the pan-seared Wagyu beef with a wild mushroom reduction. The secret to this specific dish, I explained to my lawyer, pacing slowly across the room, is a highly specific, obscenely expensive imported white truffle oil sourced from a tiny exclusive estate in northern Italy. It costs roughly $400 a bottle. In my real kitchens, my executive chefs use a delicate cold press infusion technique. The oil is applied drop by drop only after the meat has rested completely away from any heat source. It creates a rich, earthy perfection that critics rave about. I walked back to the desk and tapped my manicured fingernail sharply against the page in the decoy book. But in this ledger, I continued, my voice dripping with calculated precision. The instructions dictate that the premium Wagyu must be seared directly in a heavy pour of the truffle oil at 600 degrees. What Camilla and my parents do not understand about high-level culinary science is chemical reaction. When that specific unrefined imported truffle oil is exposed to standard commercial high heat, it scorches instantly. The molecular structure completely breaks down. It does not just burn, it turns violently, aggressively bitter. It makes premium expensive meat taste exactly like battery acid and burnt rubber. Vincent stared at me in absolute awe. He realized the sheer magnitude of the trap I had laid. I was not just letting them steal a recipe. I was handing them a chemical time bomb that would detonate right on their patrons' palates. If they follow these ledgers, Vincent murmured, shaking his head in disbelief, they will destroy their own food. But the ingredient cost alone to stock a commercial kitchen with that specific oil will bankrupt them before they even serve the first plate. Exactly, I replied, taking a sip of my espresso. They will bleed their loan shark money dry, buying inventory they are about to incinerate on opening night. I snapped back to this present reality. It was 3 days before the grand opening of my parents' counterfeit restaurant, shamelessly named Aura Origins. My private investigators had been tracking their every desperate financial move. Richard and Beatrice had secured a devastatingly high-interest loan from a notorious underground syndicate in the city, promising the dangerous lenders a massive return on investment from the opening night profits. But it was not enough to cover the exorbitant costs of executing the decoy recipes. I sat in my office reading the latest surveillance report. Beatrice had reached the absolute bottom of her financial barrel. To secure the massive commercial order of the rare Italian truffle oil required to execute the stolen menu, she had quietly liquidated her last remaining hidden asset. She had taken out a second deeply predatory mortgage on the final piece of real estate Richard's firm had not yet seized. She poured tens of thousands of dollars of dirty money into an ingredient she did not even know how to use. My parents had aggressively poached two of my most junior, inexperienced prep cooks by offering them ridiculous, unsustainable salaries. These were kids who had never managed a dinner rush, let alone executed a high-level culinary concept. Richard and Beatrice handed these junior cooks the stolen, sabotaged ledgers and demanded they replicate my exact menu. The media was eating up the drama. Local food bloggers and news outlets were relentlessly hyping up the family restaurant war, eagerly anticipating the moment my parents supposedly beat me at my own game. Richard was even giving arrogant quotes to the press, boasting about how the real talent always belonged to the family bloodline. Vincent called my private line later that afternoon. He asked if we should file the injunction now. He had the cease and desist paperwork ready to file with the federal court to stop them from opening their doors and illegally using the Aura branding. I looked out the window of my office, watching the busy Chicago street below. I thought about the $60,000 they stole from my college fund. I thought about the years I spent scraping grease off floors while they laughed at me. I thought about Elijah trying to choke out my supply lines and Camilla trying to burn my empire to the ground. No, I answered, my voice cold and absolute. Do not file a single piece of paper. We do not stop them. Let them spend every last penny of that loan shark money opening those doors. We wait. The grand opening of Aura Origins was supposed to be my parents' ultimate triumph. Richard and Beatrice had rented a sprawling multi-level dining space in the trendy West Loop district, draining the absolute last of their loan shark money to rush the renovations. From the outside, the restaurant looked like a desperate, hollow imitation of my life's work. They had copied the minimalist black and gold aesthetic of Lumina Hospitality, right down to the font on the menus. Inside the dining room was packed to maximum capacity. Beatrice had leveraged every single remaining social connection she had in Chicago, practically begging local food critics, lifestyle bloggers, and minor celebrities to attend the opening night. She was gliding between the tables in a rented designer gown, pouring cheap champagne into expensive looking glasses, playing the role of the triumphant matriarch who was reclaiming her family legacy. But the most important guests were not the food critics. Sitting in the largest, most secluded booth at the back of the room were four men wearing sharp, dark suits. They were not smiling. They were not making small talk. These were the high-ranking representatives of the underground syndicate, the ruthless lenders who had fronted Richard the millions of dollars required to open these doors. They were here to taste their investment and collect their first massive return. In the kitchen, the two junior prep cooks my parents had poached from my staff were sweating through their pristine new chef coats. They were desperately trying to execute a menu that took my executive team a decade to perfect. And right at the center of their prep station sat the stolen decoy recipe ledger, open to the page for my signature dish, the pan-seared Wagyu beef with a wild mushroom reduction. I was sitting in the back of a black SUV parked directly across the street, watching the disaster unfold through the massive glass windows of their restaurant. Vincent, my corporate attorney, sat beside me, holding a thick stack of federal legal documents. We were just waiting for the first plates to hit the tables. Inside the restaurant, the waitstaff began carrying out the main courses. Dozens of plates featuring the premium imported Wagyu beef were placed in front of the food critics and the syndicate lenders. The catastrophe was instantaneous. The junior chefs had followed my sabotaged ledger to the exact letter. They had taken the incredibly delicate, unrefined Italian white truffle oil and poured it directly into a 600-degree commercial pan before dropping the meat inside. The intense heat had instantly shattered the molecular structure of the expensive oil. It did not just burn, it underwent a violent chemical reaction. One of the leading culinary critics for the Chicago Tribune took his first bite. His eyes went wide. He immediately grabbed his cloth napkin and spit the meat out his face, contorting in absolute disgust. He reached frantically for his water glass, trying to wash away the overwhelming toxic taste. It tasted exactly like battery acid mixed with burnt rubber. The aggressive, stinging bitterness coated the back of the throat and lingered like poison. Within seconds, the entire dining room devolved into a chorus of gagging and coughing. Diners were pushing their plates away, grabbing their throats, and demanding water. The luxurious high society atmosphere my parents had desperately tried to manufacture completely evaporated, replaced by the sheer panic of 50 people realizing they had just been served highly expensive inedible garbage. The reaction from the back booth was far less polite. The four syndicate lenders did not just spit their food out. The lead lender stood up, his face dark with lethal fury. He picked up his ceramic plate and hurled it directly against the wall. It shattered, perfectly silencing the confused murmurs of the remaining guests. The lenders realized immediately that this restaurant was a complete failure. Their multi-million-dollar investment was burning to ash right on the tables. Richard completely lost his mind. He watched his reputation and his lifeline disintegrating in real time. He stormed across the dining room, his face flushed purple with rage, and kicked the swinging kitchen doors open. In full view of the disgusted food critics and the furious loan sharks, my father began screaming at the poached junior chefs. "What did you do to the food?" Richard roared, his voice echoing over the chaotic dining room. "You incompetent fools, you are ruining me. You told me you knew how to cook Isabella's menu." One of the terrified young chefs backed away, holding up the heavy leather-bound ledger like a shield. "We followed the book exactly as it was written. We seared the Wagyu in the truffle oil at 600 degrees, just like the recipe said. It is not our fault the oil burned. We just followed your instructions." Richard grabbed the ledger from the boy's hands, raising it above his head, as if he were about to strike the chef with it. That was the exact moment I stepped out of my SUV and walked through the heavy front doors of Aura Origins. I did not walk in alone. I was flanked by Vincent and two armed federal marshals wearing tactical vests. The sheer authority of our entrance cut through the screaming and the chaos. The food critics lowered their phones. The angry diners fell silent. Even the syndicate lenders at the back booth paused, recognizing that a much larger, much more dangerous game was being played. My high heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor as I walked straight toward my father. Richard froze, still holding the stolen decoy ledger in the air. Beatrice rushed over her rented gown, swishing loudly, her face a mask of absolute terror. "Isabella," Beatrice gasped, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here? Did you do this to the food?" I stopped 10 feet away from them. I looked at the ruined bitter meals sitting on the tables, and then I looked directly into my father's panicked eyes. "I did not cook the food, Beatrice," I said, my voice perfectly calm, ringing out clearly for every single person in the room to hear. "I just wrote a recipe designed specifically for a thief to steal. You wanted my life's work so badly that you committed a felony to get it. I simply let you take the poison and serve it to yourselves." Richard's arm dropped. The heavy leather ledger slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. He finally realized the magnitude of the trap he had blindly walked into. "You set us up," Richard whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his total financial ruin. "You intentionally sabotaged the books." I did not smile. I did not gloat about the culinary disaster. The ruined food was just the appetizer. I turned slightly, signaling Vincent to step forward. My attorney handed a thick sealed envelope directly to the federal marshal, who then stepped up and pressed the documents hard against Richard's chest. "I am not here about the food, Richard," I stated, my tone dropping to an icy absolute zero. "I am here about the intellectual property you are currently holding in your hand. You are being served with a $10 million federal lawsuit for corporate espionage, intellectual property theft, and trademark infringement. The federal marshals are here to officially seize all assets inside this building. Your counterfeit restaurant is permanently closed." The red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the trendy West Loop Street in harsh, flashing colors. The grand opening of Aura Origins was officially a crime scene. Federal marshals systematically cleared the dining room, taping bright orange seizure notices to the heavy glass doors. The local food critics, still wiping the taste of burnt toxic truffle oil from their mouths, filed out onto the sidewalk, aggressively typing on their smartphones to break the story of the culinary disaster of the decade. The four syndicate lenders from the back booth did not wait for the police to ask questions. They walked out with a chilling, absolute calmness. The lead loan shark cast one final lethal glance at my father before disappearing into the shadows of the Chicago night. That utter silence was far more terrifying than any verbal threat. My parents were shoved out into the biting winter wind. Camilla, who had been hiding in the kitchen after her stolen decoy recipes caused the catastrophe, stumbled out right behind them. The moment the federal marshals locked the front doors, sealing away the last of their borrowed millions and their stolen dream, the illusion of family loyalty violently shattered. They did not band together in the face of absolute ruin. They turned on each other like starving, cornered animals. Richard grabbed his thinning hair, his face flushing a dangerous shade of purple with unhinged rage. He screamed at Beatrice, his voice echoing off the brick walls of the adjacent buildings. He blamed her for pushing the counterfeit restaurant idea, for forcing him to sign predatory loans with violent criminals, and for dragging his country club reputation into the gutter. He shrieked that she was a greedy, status-obsessed parasite who had finally destroyed them. Beatrice did not absorb the blame. She immediately deflected, spinning around and pointing a trembling diamond-clad finger right at Camilla. Beatrice screamed that none of this would have happened if Camilla had not been incredibly stupid enough to get caught breaking into my office. She blamed Camilla for stealing the wrong ledgers, calling her a useless, incompetent daughter who could not even commit a simple robbery correctly. Camilla, stripped of her high society armor and shivering violently in the cold, screamed right back at the top of her lungs. She blamed them for trusting her in the first place, for putting the immense pressure of Elijah's federal bail on her shoulders, and for failing to realize it was a trap. The screaming match devolved into vicious, ugly, deeply personal insults. They tore apart every insecurity, every financial failure, and every toxic secret they had hidden behind closed doors for 30 years. They were publicly slaughtering each other in the parking lot. I stood on the sidewalk, my tailored designer coat wrapped tightly around me, watching the pathetic spectacle unfold. Vincent, my corporate attorney, stood silently at my right. Two armed federal marshals stood a few paces behind me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt the absolute cold, deeply satisfying rush of justice. I took a few slow steps forward, my high heels clicking sharply against the freezing pavement. The rhythmic, commanding sound cut through their hysterical screaming. They froze, turning to look at me with a pathetic mixture of terror and boiling hatred. "You spent 30 years trying to convince me I was the broken link in this family," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the sound of the howling wind. "You told everyone I was the unstable one, the failure, the daughter who could not fit into your perfect elite world. But look at you now. You are screaming at each other in a public parking lot, completely bankrupt, facing federal prison, and owing millions of dollars to the criminal underworld. You did not need me to break you. You just needed a mirror." Richard opened his mouth, his jaw trembling as he tried to formulate a defense, to somehow assert his authority over me one last time. But before a single word could escape his throat, the aggressive screech of tires drew our attention to the street. A sleek black town car pulled up violently to the curb, parking illegally in a loading zone. The rear door swung open. It was Elijah. My African-American brother-in-law had somehow managed to post his massive federal bail, though he looked like a hollow, broken shell of the arrogant investment broker he had been just days ago. His custom suit was deeply wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot, and his usual domineering swagger was entirely gone. He stepped out of the vehicle, his face a mask of absolute chilling self-preservation. Camilla gasped. A desperate, delusional spark of hope lit up her tear-stained face. She genuinely thought her powerful husband was there to rescue her, to use his wealth and connections, to whisk her away from the nightmare her parents had just created. She ran toward the town car, sobbing his name, reaching her arms out to embrace him. Elijah did not open his arms. He did not offer a single word of comfort. He stood like a stone statue and held up a thick manila folder. As Camilla moved in for a hug, Elijah shoved the heavy folder hard into her chest, forcing her to grab it before it hit the wet pavement. "Do not touch me," Elijah spat, his voice laced with pure, unfiltered venom. "Those are divorce papers, Camilla, and a federal subpoena." Camilla stumbled backward, clutching the documents, her eyes wide with total incomprehension. "I just spent the last 24 hours sitting in a federal interrogation room," Elijah continued, loud enough for the entire street to hear. "I told the Securities and Exchange Commission absolutely everything. I told them you were the mastermind behind the wire fraud. I told them you forced me to forge those offshore accounts to fund your shopping addiction. I am handing you over to the feds to secure a plea deal for myself. You are going to take the fall for everything, Camilla. I am leaving you to rot." The sleek black town car carrying Elijah sped away from the curb, its tires splashing freezing, dirty Chicago street water directly onto Camilla's designer boots. She stood paralyzed in the middle of the chaotic loading zone, clutching the heavy manila folder against her chest, as if it could somehow protect her from the violent reality of what had just happened. The federal marshals, who were actively taping bright orange seizure notices to the glass doors of my parents' counterfeit restaurant, paused to watch the absolute destruction of a woman who had spent her entire life believing she was untouchable. With trembling, manicured fingers, Camilla ripped the folder open right there under the harsh, flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers. I watched from the safety of the sidewalk as her eyes frantically scanned the federal subpoena and the divorce decree. Elijah had been meticulously planning his exit strategy for years. He was a ruthless, calculating corporate broker who knew his massive Ponzi scheme would eventually collapse. Every time he bought Camilla a luxury handbag, every time he funded a lavish European vacation, he had forced her to sign what he called routine marital tax disclosures. Camilla, blinded by her own insatiable greed and total obsession with high society status, had blindly signed every single page he put in front of her. She had unknowingly authorized the creation of dozens of offshore shell companies in her own name. Elijah had just handed the Securities and Exchange Commission a flawless, perfectly documented paper trail pointing directly to his ignorant wife. Camilla dropped the divorce papers onto the wet asphalt. She spun around looking for our parents. Richard and Beatrice were standing just a few feet away, watching their golden child unravel. Camilla reached out for our mother, sobbing, hysterically begging Beatrice to help her hire a defense attorney. But Richard and Beatrice had their own insurmountable nightmare to face. They had just been served with my $10 million intellectual property lawsuit, and they owed a massive unpayable debt to ruthless syndicate lenders who were currently hunting them down. Beatrice physically took a step back, pulling her rented designer gown away from Camilla's desperate grasp. Richard shook his head, his face pale with sheer terror, and turned his back on the daughter he had spent 3 decades elevating above me. They abandoned Camilla right there in the parking lot, just like they had abandoned me 15 years ago when I needed them most. 4 hours later, a brutal winter storm was violently lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown penthouse. I was sitting on my plush velvet sofa, wrapped in a thick cashmere robe, sipping a glass of rare vintage Pinot Noir. The fireplace roared quietly, casting a warm golden glow across the polished hardwood floors. My corporate attorney Vincent had just concluded a late-night video call with me, confirming that the federal court had officially processed the asset seizure of Aura Origins. My culinary empire was entirely secure and my supply chains were fully restored. The private intercom on my wall buzzed sharply, cutting through the quiet jazz playing in my living room. It was the night concierge for my luxury high-rise building. He sounded incredibly apologetic, stating that a highly erratic, soaking wet woman, claiming to be my sister, was currently causing a massive scene in the grand lobby, begging the security staff to let her see me. I could have told the concierge to call the Chicago police and have her arrested for trespassing. It would have been the easiest, most logical decision. But I wanted to see the final stage of her destruction with my own eyes. I instructed the concierge to send her up the private elevator to my personal foyer. The heavy brass doors of my private elevator chimed and slid open. Camilla literally collapsed onto the pristine marble floor of my foyer. She was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, status-obsessed woman who had sneered at my chef's apron and demanded I pay her dinner bill just days ago was entirely gone. Her expensive salon-styled hair was matted to her face, dripping freezing rain onto the stone. Her designer coat was ruined, covered in street grime and mud. Her heavy makeup ran down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, making her look like a terrifying specter of her former self. Camilla did not stand up. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, sobbing with a pathetic, raw desperation that echoed off my high ceilings. She reached out, trying to grab the hem of my cashmere robe. I took a deliberate, disgusted step backward, keeping my distance from her toxic reach. "Isabella, please!" Camilla wailed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. "You have to help me. Elijah set me up. He gave the federal agents my signature on corporate documents I never read. I am facing 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud and money laundering. I do not have a single dollar left to my name. The government froze all my accounts. I have no place to go. Mom and Dad will not even answer my phone calls. They blocked my number and told me to stay away from them." I looked down at the pathetic, shivering mess weeping on my floor. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy. I felt the highly satisfying absolute clarity of long overdue justice. "Why are you here, Camilla?" I asked, my voice cold, uncompromising, and stripped of any familial warmth. "You have spent your entire life tearing me down to make yourself feel superior. You broke into my private office in the dead of night to steal my life's work. You helped our parents borrow dirty money from the criminal underworld to try and destroy my business. What could possibly make you think I would lift a single finger to save you from a prison cell?" Camilla pressed her forehead against the cold marble floor, sobbing violently. She was entirely broken, stripped of the unearned arrogance that had defined her entire existence. "Because we are sisters, Isabella," Camilla begged, grasping at a childhood bond that had never actually existed. "We share the same blood. You are the only one with the money and the power to fix this. You have a team of ruthless corporate lawyers. You know billionaires like Maxwell Thorne. You have to hire a legal team for me. You have to protect me from the federal prosecutors. I will do anything you want. I will scrub the floors in your kitchens. I will wash your dishes. Just please, do not let them lock me away in a federal prison." I stared at the woman who had mocked my work, my passion, and my entire existence, just because I refused to be a parasite like her. I did not raise my voice. I delivered my final verdict with the surgical, lethal precision of a woman who had already won the war. A poor trash worker like me does not have the kind of lawyers you need, Camilla. I turned my back on her. Hysterical screaming, walked back into my warm, secure penthouse and shut the heavy oak door firmly behind me, leaving her alone in the storm. The morning sun was just beginning to break through the heavy winter clouds over the Chicago skyline when my private line rang. I was sitting at the marble kitchen island in my penthouse, reviewing the final asset seizure reports for the counterfeit restaurant when my father's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. I did not say hello. Your mother is dying. Isabella, Richard screamed into the receiver. His voice was frantic, trembling with a manufactured hysteria that echoed through the phone. Her heart gave out. She collapsed right in the middle of our living room this morning. We are at Chicago Memorial Hospital right now. You did this to her. The stress of your $10 million lawsuit and the public humiliation yesterday triggered a massive cardiac event. Get down here right now and call your corporate lawyers. You have to drop the lawsuit before you kill her. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring out at the icy waters of Lake Michigan. It was the ultimate desperate play of a cornered parasite. When financial manipulation and public smear campaigns fail, they resort to medical terrorism. They weaponize guilt and mortality to force a surrender. I will be there in 30 minutes, Richard. I said, my voice entirely flat. I hung up the phone. I did not rush to my closet in a panic. I did not cry. I calmly finished my morning coffee, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit, and made one very specific phone call on my way down to the private garage. When I arrived at the cardiology wing of Chicago Memorial Hospital, I did not go straight to Beatrice's room. I waited by the elevators until a tall, distinguished man in a pristine white medical coat approached me. Dr. Thomas Preston was the chief of medicine at this exact hospital. He was also an exclusive regular at Lumina's private chef's table, a man who deeply appreciated my culinary work and owed me several favors for securing last-minute VIP reservations for his high-profile board members. Good morning, Isabella, Dr. Preston said, giving me a warm, professional nod. I reviewed the admission charts you asked about. I think you will find the situation quite illuminating. Shall we? We walked down the sterile, brightly lit corridor together and pushed open the heavy wooden door to room 412. The scene inside was a masterclass in theatrical manipulation. Beatrice was lying in the hospital, wearing a pale blue gown, clutching her chest with a trembling hand. The heart monitors beeped in a steady, completely normal rhythm, but she was gasping for air, as if every breath were a monumental struggle. Richard was sitting in a plastic chair right beside her, holding her other hand, and looking utterly devastated. The moment Richard saw me step into the room, his eyes flared with aggressive, self-righteous anger. You finally decided to show up, Richard hissed, standing up and pointing a rigid finger at me. Look at what you have done to your mother. Her heart is failing. The doctors say her blood pressure is at lethal levels because of the sheer terror you caused last night. You are going to call Vincent right now. You are going to withdraw that intellectual property lawsuit, and you are going to pay off the syndicate lenders. If you do not sign the release papers today, the stress is going to cause a fatal heart attack. Her blood is on your hands, Isabella. Beatrice let out a weak, pathetic groan, squeezing her eyes shut. Isabella, please, she whispered hoarsely. I cannot take the stress. My chest is burning. Just drop the lawsuit. We are family. Do not let me die over a restaurant. I stood at the foot of the hospital bed, my expression carved from solid ice. I did not reach out to comfort her. I stepped aside, allowing the chief of medicine to step fully into the room. Actually, Beatrice, you are not going to die today, I said, gesturing to the man beside me. Mom, Dad, I would like you to meet Dr. Preston. He's the chief of medicine here at Chicago Memorial, and he took a few minutes out of his busy schedule to personally review your emergency admission files. Richard froze. Beatrice's eyes snapped open, losing their sickly, half-lidded performance as she stared at the high-ranking doctor. Dr. Preston picked up the digital chart attached to the end of the bed. He did not look sympathetic. He looked incredibly annoyed. Mrs. Vance, Dr. Preston stated, his voice ringing with absolute clinical authority. Your electrocardiogram results are perfectly normal. Your blood enzyme levels show zero indication of cardiac distress, and your blood pressure is currently resting at a very healthy 110/70. You did not suffer a heart attack. You are experiencing mild acid reflux and severe indigestion, likely caused by consuming highly acidic or burnt food late last night. I have already authorized your immediate discharge. We need this bed for patients who are actually experiencing medical emergencies. The silence in the hospital room was deafening. The heart monitor continued to beep in its steady, totally unbothered rhythm, mocking their elaborate lie. The color entirely drained from Richard's face. Beatrice slowly lowered her trembling hand from her chest, her miraculous recovery happening in a matter of seconds as the reality of being caught by the chief of medicine set in. "Thank you, Dr. Preston," I said, not taking my eyes off my parents. "I will handle it from here." The doctor nodded, gave my parents one last look of utter disdain, and walked out, closing the door firmly behind him. I walked slowly around to the side of the hospital bed towering over my mother. The fake tears had completely dried up. She shrank back against the pillows, terrified of the cold, lethal energy radiating from me. "You thought you could play the medical card to escape a $10 million federal lawsuit," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying whisper. "You thought you could manipulate me with the threat of your death. But you forgot one crucial detail, Beatrice. You already played this exact same card 10 years ago, and I never forgot." Richard swallowed hard, taking a nervous step back. "Isabella, what are you talking about?" "I am talking about Paris," I snapped, turning my sharp gaze to him. 10 years ago, I received an acceptance letter for a highly exclusive, fully funded culinary apprenticeship at Le Cordon Bleu. It was my ticket out of poverty. It was the opportunity that was going to launch my career. The very same week I bought my plane ticket, Mom suddenly announced she had stage 2 breast cancer. Beatrice whimpered, pulling the thin hospital blanket up to her chin. I canceled my flight. I continued, the raw, suppressed anger of a decade finally bleeding into my words. I gave up my dream. I stayed in Chicago working 3 brutal manual labor jobs to help pay for your supposed radiation treatments. You spent months lying in bed acting weak, making me wait on you hand and foot while I handed over every single paycheck I earned. It was not until 3 years later, when I accidentally opened an old insurance statement, that I saw the truth. You never had cancer. You had a benign, harmless cyst removed in a routine outpatient procedure. You faked a terminal illness just to trap me in this city and steal my income so you could pay for Camilla's expensive sorority fees. We needed the money, Beatrice cried out, her voice cracking as the ugly truth was finally dragged into the light. Camilla was networking with important families. She needed to maintain her status. You were just going to waste your time cooking in France. We did what we had to do for the family. And now I am doing what I have to do for mine, I replied coldly. I reached into my tailored jacket, pulled out a thick stack of federal legal documents, and dropped them directly onto Beatrice's lap. "This is not a negotiation," I commanded. "This is your absolute non-negotiable surrender. You are going to sign these non-disclosure agreements. You are going to publicly confess to the fraud against me, and you are going to hand over the deed to your suburban mansion to settle the intellectual property lawsuit. If you do not sign these papers by 5 o'clock today, I will personally hand the syndicate loan sharks the exact GPS coordinates of where you are hiding your remaining assets. And I will let the federal prosecutors put you both in prison for bank fraud." Richard gripped the back of his plastic chair, his knuckles turning white. "You cannot do this. We will fight you. We will destroy you in court." I smiled, a dark, victorious expression. "I will see you in court, Dad." I turned on my heel, my tailored crimson suit, catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room, and walked straight toward the heavy wooden door. Behind me, the silence was absolute. Beatrice was staring at the thick stack of federal legal documents resting heavily on her lap, her face pale with the terrifying realization that her lifetime of theatrical manipulation had just violently collided with a concrete wall of legal reality. Richard was still gripping his plastic chair, his breathing ragged, his arrogant pride blinding him to the fact that he was already a casualty in a war he had started. I stepped out into the sterile corridor and let the door click shut, severing myself from their toxic panic. My corporate attorney Vincent was waiting for me near the elevator bank. He held his sleek leather briefcase, checking his gold watch as I approached. They have exactly 8 hours. I told Vincent, my voice a low, uncompromising hum. The deadline is 5 o'clock sharp. If I do not have those documents signed, notarized, and delivered to my office by the deadline, we detonate the charges. Vincent nodded, tapping a sequence into his encrypted tablet. The trap we had laid within those documents was absolute. It was a flawless, inescapable legal surrender. To settle the $10 million intellectual property lawsuit for their counterfeit restaurant, Richard and Beatrice had to sign complete non-disclosure agreements. They had to hand over the physical deed to their sprawling suburban mansion, the only asset they had not yet mortgaged, to the loan sharks. Most importantly, they had to sign a binding public confession admitting to the financial fraud, the stolen college funds, and the fake medical emergencies. It was social and financial suicide for them, but it was the only way to avoid a federal prison sentence. But I knew my father. Richard was a man who worshipped his country club reputation above his own family. He would rather burn in a blazing inferno than publicly confess that he had stolen from his youngest daughter. He was going to try and find a back door. By noon, my private security team, who had been actively monitoring Richard's movements since the restaurant implosion, flagged a sudden shift in his location. Richard had left Beatrice at the hospital and was driving frantically toward the industrial outskirts of the city. He was heading straight for a climate-controlled private storage facility. It was the exact location where he was hiding his last remaining secret assets, a collection of 3 fully restored vintage sports cars. I had kept them hidden from the bank and the syndicates, intending to liquidate them for emergency cash on the black market to hire a sleazy defense attorney and flee the state. I thought he was being stealthy. He had absolutely no idea that I had placed a micro GPS tracking device on his vehicle the night of his catastrophic grand opening. I was sitting at my glass desk at Lumina Hospitality, watching his little blue dot move across the digital map on my monitor. I picked up my secondary untraceable smartphone. I drafted a very short, very precise text message. I attached the live GPS coordinates of Richard's exact location, along with the access code to his private storage unit, which my forensic accountants had uncovered days ago. I sent the encrypted message directly to the burner phone of the lead syndicate lender, the dangerous, ruthless man who had smashed his plate against the wall when he tasted the burnt truffle oil at Aura Origins. I leaned back in my leather chair and watched the map. Within 20 minutes, 3 new vehicles converged on the industrial storage facility, blocking the only exit. My security team intercepted the audio feed from a safe distance. Richard had just managed to get the rolling garage door open, his eyes gleaming as he looked at the vintage cars that would buy his freedom. But before he could even start an engine, the syndicate lenders surrounded him. The loan sharks did not raise their voices. They simply backed Richard against the cold metal wall of the storage unit, informing him that the cars now belonged to them as partial payment for his massive defaulted loan. They gave him a final terrifying warning that if he did not produce the rest of their money by the end of the week, they would start taking things far more valuable than vintage automobiles. Richard barely escaped the facility with his life. He drove away in a sheer panic, realizing that his underground exits had been completely severed. He was trapped. At exactly 4:55 in the afternoon, my office phone began to ring. I let it ring 4 times before I finally picked up the receiver. "You sent them!" Richard screamed into the phone, his voice completely unhinged, cracking with absolute terror and blinding rage. "You sent those violent monsters to my storage unit. They took everything, Isabella. They took my last safety net. You are a complete psychopath." "I simply provided a map, Richard." I replied, my tone perfectly level, showing zero emotion. "You are the one who decided to climb into bed with the criminal underworld to try and destroy my culinary empire. I just made sure your business partners knew exactly where you were hiding their return on investment. You have exactly 4 minutes left to sign that confession and hand over the deed to your house. Or I send the federal prosecutors the bank surveillance footage of you forging my signature for that commercial equity loan." I could hear him breathing heavily into the receiver. He was cornered, stripped of his hidden assets and out of time. But his fragile, toxic ego was still desperately clinging to the illusion of control. Signing that public confession meant the entire Chicago elite would know he was a thief and a fraud. He could not stomach the humiliation of surrendering to the daughter he had always called a poor trash worker. "I am not signing a single piece of paper," Richard roared, slamming his fist against his steering wheel so hard the sound echoed through the phone. "I will not let you take my house. I will not let you ruin my name. You think you are so smart with your corporate lawyers and your billionaire friends, but you are nothing. I am going to hire the most aggressive defense attorney in this city. I will drag you through the mud. I will destroy you in front of a judge." I checked my watch. The second hand ticked past the 12. It was exactly 5 o'clock. The deadline had officially expired. "I offered you a quiet surrender, Richard," I said, a dark, victorious smile spreading across my face. "But if you insist on a public execution, I am more than happy to oblige. I will see you in court, Dad." I hung up the phone, terminating the call. I immediately signaled Vincent, who was standing by the door. The trap was set, the evidence was ironclad, and my family was about to walk blindly into a courtroom massacre they could never possibly win. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago slammed shut, sealing my parents inside a reality they could no longer manipulate. We were seated in a grand, imposing courtroom for the preliminary hearing regarding the $10 million intellectual property lawsuit and the associated commercial fraud charges. I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's table, wearing a razor-sharp navy blue suit, my hands resting calmly on the polished wood. My corporate attorney, Vincent, sat to my right, organizing a remarkably thin stack of folders. We did not need mountains of paperwork. We only needed the truth. Across the aisle, Richard and Beatrice sat at the defense table. They looked physically exhausted, their country club arrogance strained to the absolute breaking point. Richard had managed to scrape together enough cash from draining his final secret accounts to hire a notoriously aggressive, sleazy defense attorney named Gordon. Gordon was the kind of lawyer who specialized in manufacturing reasonable doubt by destroying the character of the victim. The judge presiding over the hearing, a formidable and entirely no-nonsense man named Judge Caldwell, called the room to order. He looked down at the preliminary affidavits my parents had submitted under oath, which completely denied all allegations of fraud, forgery, and intellectual property theft. Gordon immediately stood up, buttoning his cheap suit jacket, and launched into a highly theatrical, entirely fabricated defense. He paced back and forth, gesturing wildly toward me, as he tried to paint a picture of a vindictive, mentally unstable daughter seeking petty revenge over a decades-old family disagreement. "Your Honor," Gordon proclaimed, his voice dripping with manufactured outrage, "what we have here is not a case of corporate espionage or bank fraud. This is simply a tragic family dispute blown entirely out of proportion by an estranged, deeply bitter young woman. My clients Richard and Beatrice are upstanding citizens. They merely attempted to open a family restaurant using traditional recipes that rightfully belong to their bloodline. As for the bank documents, they were operating under a verbal authorization from their daughter, who has a documented history of erratic behavior and sudden estrangement. She is using her wealth and her ruthless corporate lawyers to bully her elderly parents out of pure malicious spite." Richard sat up a little straighter, a smug, self-satisfied look crossing his face. He actually believed Gordon was winning. He believed that because he had spent 30 years controlling the narrative within his social circles, he could simply lie his way through a federal courtroom. I did not react to the character assassination. I just looked at Vincent and gave him a nearly imperceptible nod. Vincent stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not pace around the room. He moved with the lethal, terrifying precision of a man who knew he was holding a live grenade. "Your Honor," Vincent began, his tone calm and respectful. "Opposing counsel has just presented a fascinating piece of fiction. However, we are not here to debate family dynamics. We are here to address a highly coordinated multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. The defense claims my client is unstable and acting out of spite. I would like to submit Exhibit A to the court to demonstrate exactly who is acting with malicious intent." Vincent picked up a remote and directed the court clerk to play a video file on the large monitor mounted on the courtroom wall. The screen flickered to life, displaying the crystal clear high-definition security footage from my private office at Lumina Hospitality. The courtroom watched in absolute silence as my sister Camilla violently smashed through the glass door. The audio captured her frantic, desperate sobbing as she broke into my filing cabinet. Her voice echoed loudly across the courtroom as she screamed about stealing my proprietary ledgers to pay for her husband's federal bail, explicitly confirming that my parents were using dirty money from local syndicate lenders to fund their counterfeit restaurant. Gordon stopped pacing, the color completely drained from his face. His clients had conveniently forgotten to mention that their daughter was caught on tape confessing to the entire criminal conspiracy. That was the defendant's eldest daughter executing a targeted burglary to steal trade secrets, Vincent stated, cutting through the stunned silence. But perhaps the defense would prefer to discuss the supposedly authorized bank loan. Let us move to Exhibit B. The screen shifted to the high-resolution surveillance footage from the First Commercial Bank. The camera angle provided a perfect, unobstructed view of the manager's desk. The judge leaned forward, watching intently as Richard picked up a gold-plated pen. The video clearly showed Richard physically tracing my signature onto the commercial equity loan documents, committing felony forgery right in front of the camera, while Beatrice fed a continuous stream of lies to the bank manager. Beatrice gasped, burying her face in her hands. Richard gripped the edge of the defense table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He was watching himself commit a federal crime in 4K resolution. As you can clearly see, Your Honor, Vincent continued, his voice echoing like a judge reading a death sentence. There was no verbal authorization. There was only a calculated, premeditated attempt to steal $3 million by leveraging my client's commercial property. And finally, to address the defense's claim that these individuals are upstanding citizens, merely opening a family business, I submit Exhibit C. Vincent handed a thick, bound financial dossier directly to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge's bench. Those are the unredacted financial ledgers belonging to Elijah, the defendant's son-in-law, who is currently facing federal prosecution for running a massive Ponzi scheme, Vincent explained. Those ledgers trace the exact flow of illicit funds from Elijah's fraudulent accounts directly into the shell company Richard and Beatrice used to lease their counterfeit restaurant. They did not just steal recipes, Your Honor. They knowingly funded their operation using laundered money and loans from violent organized crime syndicates. Gordon, the aggressive defense attorney, slowly sank back into his chair. He looked at Richard with an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. He realized his clients had lied to him under oath, placing him in direct jeopardy of professional misconduct. He did not say another word in their defense. He knew the case was completely unsalvageable. Judge Caldwell slowly closed the financial ledger. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. When the judge finally looked up, his expression was a mask of absolute, terrifying judicial fury. He hated many things, but above all else, he despised individuals who walked into his courtroom and committed blatant perjury. Mr. and Mrs. Vance, Judge Caldwell's voice boomed like thunder, making Beatrice physically flinch. You submitted sworn affidavits to this court just 48 hours ago, explicitly denying all charges of fraud, forgery, and theft. The undeniable video and financial evidence presented today proves that your affidavits were nothing but a collection of staggering, malicious lies. You have not only attempted to destroy your daughter's legitimate business, but you have made a complete mockery of the federal judicial system. The judge slammed his wooden gavel down onto the sounding block. The sharp crack made Richard jump out of his seat. I am holding both of you in direct contempt of court for lying under oath, Judge Caldwell declared, his tone leaving absolutely no room for mercy. Furthermore, given the overwhelming evidence of ongoing financial fraud, money laundering, and the severe flight risk you both currently pose, I am granting the plaintiff's request for a maximum preliminary injunction. I hereby order the immediate freezing of all your financial accounts and the immediate seizure of your remaining physical assets, including your primary suburban residence, pending the final criminal trial. Beatrice let out a loud, hysterical wail, grabbing Richard's arm. Richard stood completely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. In less than 20 minutes, my lawyer had systematically stripped them of their final defense, their false narrative, and their last remaining property. I sat perfectly still, my posture impeccable. I watched the bailiff step forward to formally detain them for contempt. I did not smile and I did not gloat. I simply watched the inevitable absolute consequence of their own toxic arrogance crashing down upon them. The Dirksen Federal Courthouse in downtown Chicago was a towering monolith of black glass and steel. It was the perfect arena for the final destruction of a man who truly believed he was untouchable. I sat in the second row of the public gallery, wearing a pristine tailored ivory suit that stood out sharply against the sea of dark mahogany benches. I was not there as a plaintiff today. I was there as an architect sitting back to watch my controlled demolition go off exactly as planned. Elijah sat at the defense table. His custom-tailored silk suits and imported Italian leather shoes were gone, replaced entirely by the standard ill-fitting beige uniform of a federal inmate who had been denied bail. His high-powered corporate attorneys had abandoned him, the exact second his accounts were frozen by the government, leaving him sitting next to a visibly exhausted, overworked public defender. The trial had moved with terrifying federal speed. The Securities and Exchange Commission, armed with the pristine financial dossiers I had anonymously handed them, had cornered Elijah with multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. He had nowhere to run. But Elijah's defense strategy was as cowardly as his character. He was attempting the ultimate desperate betrayal. He had instructed his public defender to pin the entire multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme directly onto my sister Camilla. Camilla sat on the opposite side of the public gallery. She looked absolutely hollowed out. Her expensive designer clothing and heavy glamorous makeup were gone, replaced by a cheap wrinkled blouse and dark exhausted circles under her eyes. She watched in sheer horror as Elijah's defense attorney projected offshore account documents onto the massive courtroom monitors. Every single document, every fraudulent wire transfer authorization bore Camilla's signature. My client was merely a victim of a manipulative, financially abusive spouse. Elijah's lawyer argued, though he sounded entirely unconvinced by his own words. Camilla was the sole beneficiary of these offshore shell companies. She funneled the stolen investments to feed a rampant, uncontrollable luxury shopping addiction, using my client's professional access to execute the trades without his full comprehension. The assistant United States attorney stood up from the prosecution table. He did not look intimidated by the defense's narrative. He looked like an apex predator who had already caught his prey and was simply playing with his food. "Your Honor," the federal prosecutor began, his voice ringing with absolute, crushing authority. The defense's attempt to shift the blame is a fascinating piece of fiction. However, it completely ignores the supplemental digital evidence provided to our office by an anonymous, highly cooperative source just hours before this trial began. That source was me. Weeks ago, my private forensic accountants had not just tracked the money flowing out of Crestview Partners. They had dug deep into the digital architecture of the firm and unearthed a ghost server. It was a heavily encrypted off-the-books email network. Elijah used to communicate exclusively with his illegal offshore brokers in the Cayman Islands. I had handed the decryption keys directly to the federal prosecutors on a silver platter. The prosecutor pressed a button on his remote, replacing the forged signatures on the monitor with a series of time-stamped internal corporate emails. "Let us read directly from the defendant's own private server," the prosecutor announced to the breathless courtroom. An email sent by Elijah to his offshore broker dated 14 months ago. Quote, "Move the retirement funds from Richard and Beatrice's portfolios into the secondary shell account. Bury the transaction fees so the old fools do not notice. I will slip the tax liability forms into Camilla's routine marital paperwork tonight. Make sure the signature line is buried on page 40. My wife is completely oblivious. She never reads anything she signs, as long as I buy her a luxury handbag afterward." End quote. The courtroom erupted into a low, collective gasp of disgust. Camilla buried her face in her hands, letting out a shattered, humiliating sob that echoed through the gallery. Elijah had not just thrown her under the bus. He had methodically built the bus, painted her name on the side of it, and planned to run her over from the very beginning. Elijah's jaw dropped open, the arrogant color entirely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. He stared at the glowing monitor, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. His public defender slowly closed his legal pad, physically sliding his leather chair a few inches away from his client. The defense was completely dead. There was no coming back from premeditated, documented malicious intent. The presiding federal judge did not waste time with lengthy deliberations. He looked down from the high bench at Elijah with the kind of unfiltered lethal disgust reserved for the absolute lowest class of criminals. "Elijah," the judge's voice boomed, vibrating through the heavy wooden walls of the courtroom, "you utilized your position of fiduciary trust to systematically prey upon elderly investors, including your own family members. You devastated their life savings to fund a pathetic, fraudulent lifestyle, and then you attempted to frame your ignorant wife for your own orchestrated crimes. I have zero leniency for this caliber of cowardice in my courtroom." The judge raised his heavy wooden gavel high into the air and slammed it down onto the sounding block with a violent, definitive crack. "On the counts of aggravated wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering, I hereby sentence you to 12 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole." 12 years. It was the absolute maximum sentence allowed under the federal guidelines. Two armed United States Marshals immediately stepped forward. They grabbed Elijah by his arms, hauling him roughly up from the defense table. The heavy steel chains around his waist and wrists clanked loudly against the quiet tension of the room. As the marshals dragged him toward the heavy side doors leading to the holding cells, Elijah violently twisted his head around. He scanned the gallery frantically until his eyes locked directly onto mine. His face was contorted with a furious, impotent rage. He glared at me, his chest heaving, and mouthed a vicious, silent threat across the aisle. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I slowly raised my left arm, pulled back the tailored cuff of my ivory blazer, and casually checked the time on my diamond-encrusted Cartier watch. I looked back at him, offering a cold, apathetic shrug, making it abundantly clear that his entire existence, his boiling rage, and his 12-year prison sentence were nothing more than a minor scheduling blip in my incredibly successful day. Elijah screamed in frustration as the marshals shoved him through the heavy metal doors, sealing him away from society for the next decade. With the main spectacle officially concluded, I stood up from the wooden bench, smoothing the front of my suit. I turned to look across the gallery aisle. Camilla was standing completely alone. Her husband was a convicted federal felon who had just publicly humiliated her and tried to send her to prison. Her parents, Richard and Beatrice, were entirely bankrupt, stripped of their mansion, their hidden assets, and their social standing, currently facing their own impending criminal charges for the intellectual property theft. She had absolutely no money, no home, no elite friends left to call, and a reputation that was permanently, irreparably destroyed in the city of Chicago. She looked at me. Her eyes were completely hollow, devoid of the arrogant, vicious spark that had fueled her entire life. She opened her mouth, perhaps to beg for mercy, perhaps to apologize for calling me a poor trash worker, but she knew it was utterly pointless. I had already shut the door on her. Camilla turned around, pushed her way through the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, and walked out into the busy, unforgiving streets of the city. She vanished into the crowds, a penniless, broken ghost of a woman, completely erased from the world she once thought she ruled. The federal asset seizure of Richard and Beatrice's estate was swift and entirely merciless. Once Judge Caldwell signed the final contempt and fraud orders, the banking institutions descended like a flock of starved vultures. But they were barely fast enough to beat the underground syndicate. The ruthless lenders my parents had borrowed from to fund their counterfeit restaurant did not wait for the court system. They ripped through the sprawling suburban mansion under the cover of darkness, stripping it of any remaining valuables, art, and electronics, before the federal marshals even arrived to change the locks. My parents, who had spent 30 years obsessing over country club memberships, designer labels, and their fabricated elite status, were completely eradicated from Chicago's high society. With their bank accounts frozen and their names plastered across every local news outlet as disgraced frauds, they were forced to move into a tiny, rundown one-bedroom subsidized apartment on the far south side of the city. There were no more luxury cars, no more catered dinners, and absolutely no more illusions of grandeur. They were entirely bankrupt, relying on meager government assistance while awaiting their own criminal trials for intellectual property theft and perjury. I did not visit them. I did not call. They were ghosts to me now, trapped in a miserable claustrophobic purgatory of their own creation. While my parents sat in their cramped, drafty apartment, staring at peeling wallpaper, I was actively expanding my culinary empire. It was a crisp, clear Tuesday morning, exactly 3 months after the courtroom massacre. I was driving my custom black SUV through a heavily industrialized neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, heading to survey a massive commercial warehouse space for Lumina Hospitality's newest supply hub. The drive was long, the morning air was biting, and I needed caffeine before my meeting with the commercial real estate brokers. I pulled over onto a cracked pothole-ridden street corner and parked in front of a dingy, low-end roadside diner. The neon sign above the door was half-broken, buzzing with a cheap electrical hum. The windows were smudged with grime. It was the exact kind of greasy bottom-tier establishment my family would have previously scoffed at with utter disgust. But I had built my life from the ground up, and I had never been above drinking cheap black coffee from a roadside counter. I pushed open the heavy glass door, the small brass bell above it ringing weakly. The air inside smelled strongly of stale fryer, grease-burnt toast, and cheap industrial bleach. The diner was nearly empty, save for two truck drivers eating in a corner booth. I stepped up to the scuffed laminate counter, pulling a crisp $100 bill from my leather wallet. I waited patiently for the sole employee on shift to finish her task. A woman was bent over behind this counter wearing a cheap synthetic brown uniform and a heavily soiled, grease-stained apron. She was aggressively scrubbing the inside of a massive, foul-smelling plastic trash can with a stiff, bristled brush. She wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of a thick rubber glove, muttering under her breath about the disgusting smell of the garbage. "I will take a large black coffee, please," I said, my voice perfectly level and calm, cutting through the dull hum of the diner's old refrigerator. The woman froze. Her shoulders went completely rigid under the cheap brown fabric. The stiff, bristled cleaning brush slipped from her gloved fingers, clattering loudly against the bottom of the empty plastic trash can. She stood up very slowly, wiping her hands on her stained apron, and turned around to face the counter. It was Camilla. The absolute suffocating horror that washed over her face was a masterpiece of karmic justice. Camilla, the former high society socialite who had once demanded I pay her exorbitant dinner bill just to earn my keep in the family, was standing in front of me, smelling of rotting garbage and cheap degreaser. The divorce from Elijah had left her entirely destitute as he successfully shielded his hidden assets and pinned the media fallout on her. Her reputation was so thoroughly destroyed by the public scandal that she was completely unemployable in the corporate sector. She had no corrupt husband to bail her out, no stolen trust funds to rely on, and no elite friends to hide behind. She was completely trapped in the exact manual labor life she used to mercilessly mock. Camilla stared at my tailored designer coat, my pristine leather handbag, and my calm, unbothered expression. Her lips trembled, parting slightly, but absolutely no words came out. The sheer crushing humiliation paralyzed her completely. She looked down at her own filthy apron, then back up at me, her eyes welling with tears of pure, unadulterated shame. She mechanically turned to the commercial coffee machine, grabbed a cheap paper cup, and poured the black liquid. Her hands were shaking so violently that the dark coffee spilled over the rim, burning her fingers. She did not even flinch from the heat. She pushed the cup across the laminate counter, refusing to meet my eyes. I did not smile. I did not laugh. I did not waste my breath gloating over her absolute destruction. True power does not require a dramatic speech. I simply slid the crisp $100 bill across the counter, placing it right next to her trembling hand. "Keep the change, Camilla," I said, my voice echoing with icy, absolute finality. "I respect honest trash workers." I picked up my coffee, turned my back on her shattered reality, and walked out the glass door. I stepped into the bright morning sunlight, got into my luxury vehicle, and drove away to build my empire, leaving my sister entirely alone with her karma. Exactly 1 year had passed since the night my family's empire of lies collapsed into absolute ruin. I stood in the center of the grand ballroom on the top floor of Maxwell Thorne's newly constructed Chicago skyscraper. Tonight was the official grand opening of Lumina Apex, the 10th and most ambitious restaurant location in my hospitality group. The space was nothing short of breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, 360-degree view of the glittering city skyline. Massive crystal chandeliers cascaded from the vaulted ceilings like frozen rain, and the air was filled with the vibrant, joyful hum of genuine celebration. Waitstaff in pristine black uniforms circulated smoothly through the crowd, carrying silver trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres. In the open concept kitchen, my culinary team was executing my signature Wagyu dish with flawless precision. They were using the imported white truffle oil, perfectly applying it away from the heat, with the exact cold press technique that made the dish legendary. It was a beautiful, poetic contrast to the toxic, burning disaster my parents had created in their desperate attempt to steal my legacy. I looked around the packed room, taking in the faces of the people who had actually helped me build this empire. My executive chefs were laughing near the marble bar, sharing stories and toasting to another highly successful expansion. Vincent, my fiercely loyal corporate attorney, was chatting amiably with Maxwell Thorne near the entrance. These people were my true chosen family. They were the ones who stood by my side when my supply chains were choked, when the media attacked, and when the brutal legal battles raged. There were no toxic relatives demanding unearned respect tonight. There were no arrogant brothers-in-law flaunting leased watches, and no manipulative parents forging signatures for a quick payout. The toxicity had been entirely excised from my life. I picked up a delicate crystal flute of vintage champagne and tapped it gently with a silver spoon. The clear, sharp chime instantly quieted the massive room. Hundreds of faces turned toward me, their expressions reflecting nothing but profound respect and shared triumph. I did not mention my biological family. They did not deserve a single breath of my time, not even as a cautionary tale. They had lost their power over me the moment I stopped begging for their approval. Thank you all for being here tonight. I began, my voice carrying effortlessly across the grand dining room. 10 years ago, I started with absolutely nothing. I was told that I would never amount to anything more than a failure. I was told that my dreams were frivolous, and that my only worth was what I could provide to people who wanted to keep me small. But looking around this room tonight, looking at the incredible professionals who operate my kitchens and manage my corporate offices, I know that we proved them wrong. I stepped out from behind the podium, walking closer to my staff. We did not just ask for a seat at the table of high society. I continued, meeting the proud eyes of my executive chef. We built an entirely new table. We built an environment where hard work is rewarded, where loyalty is fiercely protected, and where respect is earned through absolute integrity, not demanded through fear or manipulation. Every single person in this room was chosen because of your character and your dedication to excellence. I raised my champagne flute higher into the air. This 10th location is more than just a restaurant. It is a testament to resilience. It is absolute proof that when you know your own worth, no one can ever bankrupt your spirit. You cannot be destroyed by people who only know how to consume. To Lumina Hospitality, and to the family we choose to build. The room erupted into a roaring, heartfelt applause. Glasses clinked enthusiastically, and the celebration resumed with an even brighter, more electric energy. Vincent caught my eye and raised his glass to me from across the room, a silent acknowledgement of the brutal war we had won together. I stepped away from the crowd, needing a moment of quiet reflection, away from the music and the flashing cameras. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and walked out onto the private outdoor terrace. The freezing Chicago wind whipped through my hair, but the custom-tailored ivory coat I wore kept me perfectly warm. I walked to the edge of the thick glass railing and looked down at the sprawling illuminated grid of the city stretching out for miles below. Somewhere down there in the dark, my parents were sitting in a cramped, subsidized apartment, entirely forgotten by the high society they once worshipped so desperately. Somewhere in a maximum security federal penitentiary, Elijah was counting the days of his 12-year sentence, stripped of his luxury suits and his stolen millions. And somewhere in a greasy, low-end roadside diner, Camilla was scrubbing floors trapped in the exact life she had once deemed entirely beneath her. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my champagne. The crisp, clean taste grounded me in the present moment. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel the need to prove myself or justify my existence. The ultimate payoff of this entire ordeal was not their absolute destruction. Their ruin was merely a consequence of their own greed. The true reward was my profound, unshakable peace. They had tried to bury me for 30 years, completely unaware that I was a seed. I looked out over the glittering skyline that I now commanded from the top floor of a billionaire's skyscraper. The city lights sparkled like diamonds against the black water of the lake. The best revenge is living a life they can only watch from the bottom. Looking back on the ashes of my family's destroyed illusions, the greatest lesson I learned is that your worth is never determined by the people who try to keep you small. For years, I believed if I just worked hard enough, I could earn their respect. But parasites do not respect their hosts. True power comes from walking away from toxic tables and building your own empire from the ground up. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. Have you ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your experience and comment below.